Hello.
Evening all.
Hi guys.
Hello.
Right, Chris, would you lead the way? Then we can, or should I just get going?
Right, welcome everyone. Hope you can all hear me now. We've got 13 so far. Somebody with their finger up or thumb up, I've been like this. So Anthony, yes, welcome, and welcome to Gillian and all the other friends. Some people we don't know. They are, one's called a Galaxy J5 Prime, the other one's called 12345. So maybe he'll identify himself a bit later. Anyhow, Anthony, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad to hear that we've even got alien life forms joining in our discussion this evening. It's always good to have all sorts. Can you all hear me okay? Stick up your hands or fingers. Great stuff. Yeah, it's been an interesting little journey for us. But first of all, I'd like to add my own welcome to Chris's. So good evening and welcome to another in our series that I've taken the liberty of calling Talking Hi-Fi, which I'm sure you'll find we'll have plenty of talking and quite a bit of hi-fi. And as you know, that's brought to you by the Cape Town Hi-Fi Club. Well, it started as a lockdown alternative to our monthly meetings, and it generated such a lot of interest that we thought, well, why not do this on a more regular basis? So we've interviewed the likes of Lance Dixon, who's the creator of the Revolve turntable, local audio distributor Heinz Streicher, and Rudy Marloff, who is an innovative amplifier and speaker designer. Just a point before we get going with this evening's chat, and I'll probably interject now and then with messages from the would-be sponsor, because we do have to pay the bills. You know, extended Zoom sessions do entail a small cost, and so do consider becoming a member of the Cape Town Hi-Fi Club, and there are benefits, which I'll go into later. This evening, we're going to be talking to Guillaume Lemaire. He's the man behind Croak Audio Exploration. Now, Guillaume, could you just give us an indication as to what led to this amphibian moniker of yours?
Oh, all right. It started off as a bit of a joke. Myself and my friend Neelam Naran, who's a hi-fi technician up here in Joburg that I've known for 25 or more years, and we work together. We meet up and talk nonsense, talk music, and talk hi-fi, and we always talk a little bit about what people are doing, what manufacturers are making, and what they're charging for this stuff. And, you know, there are probably 100 products in this book that we've talked about that have never really been created. But, you know, we played with names or talked about names, and we always found a lot of the hi-fi companies there's some cool ones like, you know, Krell, which are those very intelligent machines. And, you know, I guess Madrigal, I think, is quite clever in a type of singing, and bel canto. But then there's a lot of this, you know, audio research and audible illusions and companies that are excellence or audio or something research or this acoustics, etc. And I think it was especially sort of the trying to be eloquent in the naming of equipment that we actually thought is almost a bit too much. And then, you know, we thought, well, he said, well, Buckethead Electronics, and we Croak. And that Croak thing just came back years later when I had to come up with a name for, when I started importing funk turntables, which was also an interesting brand with a strange or different name. And the whole Croak conversation just came back. And it was just being a little bit, I suppose, anti-ordinary, and also just remembering how it shows. People will often remember great systems. They'll remember the color of the room, the shape of the speakers, the wood veneer that the speaker was made out of. But if it was an audio something or a research desk or a something acoustics that was either being played or that was the company displaying it, people would often not remember the name because they all sound so similar. You know?
Well, I like the way you've parlayed it into Capetownhificlub. That's quite clever. But before we get on to the meat and potatoes of this evening's discussion, I'm sure it's been a fascinating journey. I'm just intrigued that nobody has yet thought of the name serpent lubrication, given this the subject. Anyhow,
Well, I've started a brand, Amphibian Audio, which at this point only has a cleaning liquid, so maybe that's close.
Okay, all right. Well, do you want to run us through your background, maybe a bit of education, where you grew up? Who is Guillaume Lemaire?
I was born in Maastricht in the Netherlands, which is a town full of Catholic churches with big organs, and marching bands are a big thing. So as a kid, I was exposed to quite a lot of that. We came to South Africa in 1989, the country of my mom's birth. I did my primary school and part of high school education in the Netherlands, and then came to South Africa and started studying electronics at college here, but already started selling hi-fi on weekends while studying, and figured out that business or being in the hi-fi business or something was maybe fun. And I decided to then also carry on studying and study procurement. So in between hi-fi, there's been periods of procurement and mining and heavy engineering, but always having hi-fi as a hobby, often as a hobby, either helping people at shops or selling some stuff or whatever. It's sort of, I think since I started selling hi-fi when I was 15, and I think there's been a 6-month period in which I was not at all involved in hi-fi commercially since then, and that's quite a long time ago.
So it's pretty much a lifelong career then, goodness me. And just as an aside, this is a personal thing, but where I'm sitting right now, the place I live in is actually built on a part of a farm that is called Maastricht, but that's by the way.
I believe there's a wine. Is there a wine from that estate?
It is indeed that very estate.
Yes, okay, I've seen it.
Okay. Guys, as to the participants, viewers, if you've got any questions of your own, please feel free to put them up on the chat board on the side, or if you want to wait till later and have a personal chat with Guillaume, feel free to do that as long as he feels capable and up to it. The history part of it, as you say, goes back to youth, teenagerdom. What got you started was a hobby, and that's led to quite a serious presence in the hi-fi world locally. And could you give us an idea of what brands you represent?
At the moment, I still represent some of the original brands I started with, which is the Funk Firm, which are innovative turntables and accessories and tone arms. Sumiko was one of the original brands as well. I still do that. They do phono cartridges that they've been doing phono accessories and cartridges for nearly 40 years. There's also Moth Group, which is really just a small company in the UK that is they do record cleaning machines and accessories, and Riga tone arms, but branded Moth. For every other turntable manufacturer that needs to put an arm on their turntable that don't want to say Riga, they can buy these Moth arms, and I've been importing them for a long time as well. More recently I started importing Bauer Audio, and after that Lindemann Audio, and Cardus has sort of been there. I think Cardus was the third brand. I've been doing Cardus for a really, really long time as well, Cardus cables. I tend to try and look for companies that are innovative at what they do. I think there's a lot of over-engineering in hi-fi. I think that's the easy way out. It just costs more money, I like guys who come up with solutions to problems that don't necessarily mean throwing more aluminium at it, and closer machining tolerances. So that's some of the reasons why I like Bauer Audio and the Funk Firm, because they have different solutions to the problems without just making ginormous heavy turntables. And I think Cardus is quite different as well in how they approach things.
You've clearly got quite a different approach to many of the bigger guys out there. And does that mean that you've sought out, besides companies with those qualities, have you also sought out individuals behind those companies? Have you built up relationships with the guys involved?
Most certainly. I think that comes a lot from most of the companies I deal with are still completely owner-driven. You know, the guys who are at the head of the company tend to be the designer or the people who actually started the company right at the beginning, perhaps excluding Sumiko. And I think it's important. And I think as a smaller distributor and retailer doing more niche, more slightly boutique products, I suppose you could call it. I like products that have still a personal touch, where the philosophy of the brand is still very much that of its founder, and not just by a clever mission statement written by the marketing department, but, you know, really still what the company is about.
It's an unfortunate turn of phrase that you use the word mission in relation to what you were talking about. I saw something earlier today about the companies that have been bought over by big conglomerates. And it is so in the modern world that many of them are part of big organizations, and few of them are this you know, people who are still related to the original. But I guess there are still enough of those to make it interesting.
There are some, and companies like, I think, but especially Bauer Audio, Lindemann Audio, and Cardus, I get in conversations with them, they don't necessarily want to grow massively. They obviously would like to see increases in sales. Everybody wants that, but they're not trying to take over a particular market segment. They want to keep doing what they're doing it with people that they've employed for a long time. You know, they're businesses where they know everybody in the organization, and they have specific ideas and specific goals in terms of their sound and audio and what they expect, and they want to keep it real, you know. And I guess the challenge always comes when one of those guys wants to retire. With Cardus Audio, we're fortunate that Angela Cardus started to take over the reins of the company, and George is still doing a lot of the development and design work, but the running and the marketing and the sales side of it is all done by Angela. But yeah, one would wonder where things might go when some of these guys get to ages where they no longer want to run a company. I think that's the big challenge. I mean, we all like these little companies, but there's a point where some succession planning, I think succession planning is very tough for a boutique company. But while this is all still some time away, I'm very happy to be dealing with these guys.
Well, and I guess it's another one of those truisms that the grandkids don't necessarily want to carry on with the same line of business. Anyway, be that as it may. You mentioned quite a few names that are big in the analog world, and so that seems like a fairly big part of your business. And what is the most active area for you at the moment?
It's an absolute mix. You can't really pinpoint anything that is really big specifically. So you'll have weeks or months where you're very, very busy with entry-level turntables. And next thing you do a couple of high-end ones, or just a high-end tone-arm, or some really big cartridges, or big phono stages. It is kind of all over the place, and I try and look after from reasonably priced to quite high-end. But one thing recently, having created the Groove Care brand, which it's a completely my brand. It's not some people believe it's an import, and then go looking online and say, but they can't find anything internationally. But that's because it's a Croak brainchild, really. What I have seen with that is that the market for affordable stuff that is decent, that average folk who are not necessarily audiophiles, but just want to enjoy a bit of music at a reasonable quality level, is actually very, very big. And I think some of the hi-fi companies are missing the boat on recruiting some of these kids, or just people for that matter, not just kids.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, you know, the demographic, because there's an image that is created that there's a bunch of boring old farts or old talkies. Is that something that is just you know, overactive imaginations, or is it much more widely spread than that?
I think it's quite true. I think the average audiophile that I do meet and see and talk to is probably, the youngest is probably in their mid to late 30s, significant amounts in their 40s, and plenty that are a lot older. And I think the industry sort of messed up a little bit. When the iPod came out, everybody in the audiophile industry sort of poo-pooed it and said, you know, this sounds no good, and it's, you know, it uses compressed music that can't sound any good, and this is all a bunch of rubbish. And a lot of time was spent telling everybody who was already an audiophile that this was rubbish, rather than actually spending time with those kids that are now suddenly listening to music as an event, not in the background on their computer while they're busy working or doing something else. Or, you know, the iPod actually brought music back as an event. And I don't think the industry actually saw it for what it was, and did the right thing to try and show those people using iPods, but hey, this can sound better, you know. And that whole market seems to have been handed over to the computer accessory makers. Mm-hmm. You know, and only now in the last, say, 10 years or 7 years, everybody's trying to make a headphone, whether you're NAD, PSB, or Bowers and Wilkins, or, you know, Sonus Faber. Everybody's now trying to make headphones, but they're sort of doing it 7 years too late.
Yeah, just interesting, that point about the headphones. What's your view on phones versus speakers as an audio experience? And I guess here we have to distinguish also between your on-ears and your in-ears and whatnot. What's your view on that?
I think both can be a significant and very thrilling experience, but they are different. But even listening to hi-fi is different to the live event. Ultimately, I think what one's trying to get from any audio system, whether it be headphones, loudspeakers, is enjoyment of music, being pulled into the performance, and for it to be an event in its own right that's compelling and thrilling and exciting, and significant, even if it's actually somewhat different to a live event, but it is still an event. And as long as I think it's important that, and I'm stealing words from the guy who designs neat loudspeakers in the UK, as long as the artifice by which the music is delivered is not obvious, it can be a really enjoyable experience. And that's the trick of good hi-fi, is to make it a musical event, perhaps different to live, but without letting on that it's fake, without the equipment kind of coming to the fore. Yes. I think that is that is tricky, and that can be done with headphones or loudspeakers. They're different. What I love about headphones is you don't have to choose. You know, most people won't be able to have 2 or 3 of the best loudspeakers in the world in their homes. You might not be able to afford it, but you probably wouldn't have the space. But with headphones, you could have, and most guys that are into headphones will have 2 or 3 really good pairs of headphones, and depending on different moods and different music, they might choose a different headphone, which would be great with speakers, but is not as practical.
Of course, and then that leads me to an area of your interests and business that has garnered quite a lot of attention, and that's the tweakery part of it, and we'll get onto cabling in a bit. But as far as headphones are concerned, to what extent can an individual tweak, modify headphones? You know, I speak as somebody who has a couple of pairs but hasn't really meddled around with them.
I haven't done a lot of modification to headphone myself, to be honest, not on the acoustics part of it. Most of the mods that I would have done would have been related to wiring them to either make them capable of balanced operation so that you can get a bit more voltage swing out of portable devices, or just so you'd be able to change a cable on headphones that maybe don't normally allow that. But there's a massive amount of tweaking, going on. The internet is, of course, full of guys posting different ideas. I've played a little bit with different acoustic foam in the back of open ear headphones, more to try and get less noise leakage, but still keeping an open headphone type sound. I think there's a reasonable amount of tweaking can be done with headphones, but I don't think it's something that I entirely grasp or understand. So I've stuck to the electrical parts of it rather than the acoustic parts.
Well, I think maybe somebody here with younger ears, I see there have been a couple of responses to my suggestion that people use the chat line, particularly in response to my comment about their age. So yes, Rocco, your 23 years have reduced the average age from 60 to 59 and a half. And thank you.
Well done, Rocco.
What are some of the areas, and we've talked a bit about mild tweakery, but what are some of the audio areas that you're involved with that the consumer can still expect decent improvements with a fairly modest outlay? Or to put it another way, maybe, what are some of the areas that we often neglect in terms of improving our audio experience?
I think the room and setup. I think the room has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years. I think there, with the internet, a lot of online calculators allowing people to learn more about acoustics, model their rooms online and things like that. But even way beyond that or before that, I actually find it quite sad. I'll go to somebody's home to help set something up or check something out or deliver an item and hook it up. And people that, when speaking to them, you really felt that they're really quite seriously into audio, but the way things are set up are kind of compromised by the living room and how it had to fit into the living room. And I think sometimes people really should take the living room into account more and maybe discuss with the spouse where they're allowed to place stuff before purchasing it. So I think there's a lot of guys who end up with really big loudspeakers that they then have to push up right against the wall. They know it's wrong, and they probably could have gotten better performance out of something smaller that would have been tolerated in the setting, set up more optimally than this large item. Maybe spikes never being fitted properly to loudspeakers, or speakers not being set level, the spikes rocking backwards and forwards. Spending the big budget on the loudspeakers and having very little money left for a little bit of wire. And I'm not even talking exotic wires, sometimes really nasty stuff being used. Turntables sitting on cupboards that are really not firm. So I think the basics. A lot of people throw money at equipment without actually being maybe ready to get the basics right of using that equipment at home. And I think that's quite sad. And I think it's sad when you go, especially sad when you go and somebody's actually committed to purchasing a fairly high performance item or even a fairly high performance, something like a cable, only to then find his fundamentals are actually so far off the mark that he probably isn't going to get all the benefit of the money that he's actually just spent. I think, so to me, basics more than anything, rather than get in somewhere and tweak. Just get the basics right. Nice solid connections. Make sure the speaker doesn't rock backwards and forwards. Have it positioned appropriately for that size of loudspeaker. Fairly, even just good cable. Nothing necessarily exotic. Just good connectors, well shielded cable, adequate gauge loudspeaker cable. The basics. I think that is really the main thing. And then, don't have a couch halfway in front of the loudspeaker that is, causing problems, that sort of thing. I think that's the easiest way where I think 30%, 40% of people could actually still improve what they've got.
Now, Guillaume, you've mentioned the dreaded C word several times, and I don't mean COVID. Um, cables are a ticklish subject, and you're welcome to expound on your views on that. And I would describe you possibly as a cable adherent. But I think to the ordinary individual who would like possibly to experience something different, or to find out why an improvement can be gained, what kind of criteria should somebody look for in looking for a cable?
Solidity before bling. So I think there's a lot of smart looking connectors out there and smart looking cables that are really just mediocre stuff dressed up. So try and avoid those. So I mean, even if you're going to look at some banana plugs, actually stick them into the back of a loudspeaker at the dealer and actually see how firm they actually make contact. Ideally with your with your brand of loudspeaker if you can, because you know a banana plug, for example, needs to be 4 millimeters, but you can't have an exact 4 millimeter plug fitting an exact 4 millimeter hole. Mm-hmm. One of them has got to be smaller and one of them's got to be larger. And there's no real industry standard on exactly which one's got to be over 4 millimeters and which one's got to be under. So sometimes you can have a banana plug that really looks quite smart, that just doesn't fit very snugly into a particular brand of loudspeaker, for example. But there is also a lot of plugs and connectors that are just really not very good. They look smart, they've got a nice gold flash coating on top of them, but deep down inside they use ferrous metals, which in my experience, you shouldn't use as an audio conductor. You should really avoid magnetic materials.
And you're not mentioning any names here.
Sorry?
If you might just interject, you're not mentioning any names here, but I think some of us will have a good idea of what you're getting at, unless you'd like to mention names.
No, I think it's fairly obvious. I think there's a lot of stuff coming out of the Far East that is good, but there's also a lot of stuff that mm-hmm. really isn't very good quality.
So how can you tell?
I guess you would probably have to do a little bit of research, but I think the price point also often gives it away. I'm not saying you need to spend massive money, but if a reputable company can't really do a good banana plug under, say, 70 or 80 rands, you can't expect something that you can buy for 15 rands to really be of a good quality. But if you do a little bit of looking around, you'll see some of the brands plugs that have been broken, and you can actually see what's inside them. That gives you a pretty good idea.
So you talk quite a bit about connectors, and I think, let's say, criteria there would be they've got to be solid, they've got to fit, they've preferably got to be of a certain chemical composition or metal composition, and one does one's
mostly
research.
Non-magnetic, yeah.
I didn't get that.
Mostly non-magnetic.
Yeah, non-magnetic. Which is easy to spot.
And ideally a relatively thick plating. Sadly, most of that stuff you only figure out, the plating especially, you're normally on the cheaper plugs, after a couple of years, you see how badly they tarnish because the plating is just so thin, and somehow they do manage to tarnish. But I guess there is still value in dealers, people who sell the stuff and I don't know, have certain quality standards and experience with product. I mean, we're all going to get caught at some point. We'll take on a line and start selling it, only to find out down the line that it really isn't what we thought it was, it's sad, but it does happen. But you kind of don't carry on with it, I suppose. But there's a lot of nasty stuff. Also on the plugs themselves, the tiny little grub screws that you need a jeweler screwdriver to pinch the cable with. That it doesn't necessarily give you a really nice firm connection. You can use those plugs, but then at least perhaps solder them rather than just try and tighten down with a little grub screw. Don't try and put massive cables into thin plugs and then trim back some of the strands to make it fit. I think that's another big thing that I see people do wrong, I suppose, with cables, is they try and shoehorn stuff into stuff that just doesn't work together, and then wonder why it didn't really give them much of an improvement, or they convinced themselves they did actually hear an improvement, but a few months later come back to you and come to you and say, but I've got this intermittent problem on the one channel, and you just find that they've done something really dodge trying to make a thick cable fit into a really small connector or something like that.
All right, now we're still stuck at the connector end. Now, what about that piece of wire that fits in the middle? What should one be looking for?
You want to be of a decent gauge. You want to be of a decent gauge. Obviously, you'd like it to be copper, or I suppose if you have lots of money, silver. You can try silver, but at least copper. Make sure that what you're buying is copper. Some platings are not bad. Tin plating actually does protect copper, and strangely doesn't seem to have a vastly negative effect. A company from Sweden called Supra, they tend to tin plate a lot of their cables, and they make decent, good sounding, honest cables as well. But try and make sure that what you're buying is actually copper, and try and look at the insulation. If you can, try and ask the dealer or wherever you can to just strip away a little bit of the cable and actually see that you're not buying 1 millimeter of wire and 3 millimeters of plastic, because that's very popular with a lot of the stuff sold as speaker cable that seems quite affordable. Nice translucent, thick insulation that works as a magnifying glass, but when you then actually strip it, you end up with not very much at all.
Okay. I think maybe it's just time for a quick ad break. We at the Cape Town Hi-Fi Club, we're running a bit of a special on a Dayton Audio DAC 1 for R1,000, where I gather there is one left. So if you want to find out more about that, it's apparently very highly regarded. It's small, portable, cheap, well, relatively cheap. So have a look at AV forums, there are details there, and you'll find plenty about it online. If you want to try something different, and if you maybe want to get a gift for somebody as a celebration of the end of lockdown, maybe in 2025 or somewhere around there. At any rate, Guillaume, back to you. You offer quite a few bespoke services, it seems to me, the cable building. And what are the sorts of things that you do? Tell us a bit about that area of your work.
Well, I guess it all started still as a teenager, seeing these beautiful Van den Hol cables at the time, and some Audio Quest. But they were always quite expensive to me. And I think the exotic or the better cables at the time were comparatively more expensive then than they are now. I quite strongly remember a NAD amplifier being just over R1,000 or 1,200 rands or something like that, and the cheapest Van den Hol interconnect being about 300 rands. Which I think it's today you can buy good cable from brands like that at a smaller percentage, if you will, of the entry-level integrated amplifier. They were quite expensive. So being busy studying electronics and already tinkering and having bought a pre-owned Riga turntable and getting my hands dirty on hi-fi in that way, I started making cables with any interesting looking signal type cable, whether it was some sort of RF coaxial cable, microphone cables, anything that came across my path, I would stick a set of RCA plugs on. And because the plugs are often a really expensive part of the exercise, I started reusing the plugs. So I think I got quite a lot of experience, making cables that way. And then a bit later on, I started working for the then importers of Van den Hol, who used to import a lot of the cable in bulk, including separate packaging, separate connectors. And we used to actually make the cables up locally and package them in imported packaging. which obviously saved on European labor cost versus me, as I think at the time a student, doing it in the evening with my girlfriend, making up all these cables. So I've been sticking plugs on fancy wires for a really, really, really long time. And I'm not sure how it came about. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Cardus Audio hasn't really got an entry-level interconnect that is terminated in the USA, but they do have a number of cables that they sell into the studio market. And those are available to me off the reel. So to offer a reasonable priced cable interconnect from the Cardus brand on the South African market, I started bringing in this raw cable and then putting plugs on locally. And I think that's where it started. It was just terminating RCA cables, and suddenly, well, hang on, if you're doing it, can you maybe make it, can you give me half a meter, or 0.4 for my headphone stack, or I need 1.5 meters or 1.8. And, that was sort of, to get a good quality cable custom terminated wasn't available that easily. And I think it just grew from there. And I started making cables with RCAs one end and XLRs on the other, and mini jacks to RCA. And, some companies like Griffin will use very specific LEMO type connectors, not LEMO, something else, on their phono interconnect. And somehow I just became the guy that people would end up having these strange conversions done, and also repairs, So hi-fi cable tends to get tried out by, audiophiles and their friends, and they swap cables, and, people try different things, and they get plugged and unplugged a lot of times, and some of these wires are quite stiff. So you end up with connectors, the end of the wire getting fatigued and things breaking off, or just, so over the years, I've just started repairing those and reconfiguring bi-wire cables to single wire, or single wire to bi-wire, bi-amping, etc., etc. So as long as, I guess, as long as I can get the connector, and as long as I can make the connector fit the cable, I'm fairly happy to build whatever configuration people are after.
So that's a big part of what you do. And it intrigues me that even today, there's still an interest in do-it-yourself, although maybe it's changing emphasis somewhat. That raises a question because of cost, because that's something that's, I think, has given rise to a lot of DIY in the past. There's been a cost factor. And what's your thoughts on the cost of hi-fi in today's economic climate? Is it even worth pursuing hi-fi? When we've got this younger generation brought up on a completely different experience of music.
I hope the industry is doing their best to create product for those younger people. And I think a company like Lindemann Audio realized a couple of years ago that people are not, the younger generation, if you do catch them with, and they do like high-end hi-fi or high-end sound, they're not that keen on having a CD transport and DA converter, a preamp with a separate power supply, and a set of monoblocks, perhaps if they were Jeff Rowlands, with a set of separate battery power supplies running for that, maybe some loudspeakers with external crossovers, sort of 12, 14 boxes just to play some tunes off a CD. So I think that's one of the reasons why a company like Devialet, which has got more corporate money for advertising, has been so successful in a new idea of hi-fi that is more integrated, still very high performance, but more compact, and aesthetically, maybe the jury's still out on that. Some people love the look, some people don't. But it's certainly far less imposing than some of the traditional high-end we've had. And I'm drifting away from cost now, but I think what's important, if high-end is to remain appealing to newer people coming in, is it's got to be convenient, good sounding, reasonably compact and smart. There will still be people wanting to buy the retro stuff, biggish stuff, but they tend to those guys tend to focus on integrated amplifiers more than pre-power. One of the reasons loudspeakers, which I also sell like Harbuth, are so popular is because, you know, they're not, except for their big model 40.1, but most of them are manageable sizes, and people are starting to gravitate towards that. But getting back to cost, I think with careful choices, I think there's really good audio to be had brand new for not crazy prices. And I think one of the killer products there is, for instance, the Blue Sound Power Node, you know, which at 18,000 Rand odd is an amplifier, basically an amplifier, a DAC and the streamer, has a good headphone output. You can Bluetooth connect to and from it. And if you take that 18,000 Rand and convert that into 20 or 30-year-old numbers, that is less than we were paying for a NAD 3020 in the 80s. And it's actually offering you more. And it's offering you really good sound quality. So I think there is hope. We just need to try and draw those people in by not being too snobbish, you know, in approaching people. And yeah, I suppose if we want to carry on enjoying audio as consumers and dealers, let people hear stuff as much as you can. When you have an opportunity to show something that can be done, let them hear it. I think, and in all my years in retail and ordinary shops, if I didn't have a customer I was looking after at the time, I don't mind spending 30 minutes, 40 minutes with a youngster who, you know, he may have caught a lift to the shopping center with his mom. Play him some stuff. Just expose them. I think the more people you expose, the more chances the hobby and the whole industry has of actually surviving. But I think there's some good affordable product out there, and headphones, I think, are doing a lot to getting kids, younger people, hearing that, you know, it can be better than what we've come to expect that comes in the box when we buy a phone or whatever. And slowly but surely, some of those people are starting to listen to speakers and to hi-fi, and some of them will stick with it. But I think it's got to be smart and compact. I think the days of 12 boxes to play music, those are numbered, you know.
Guillaume, I just imagine that when you look at these youngsters that you were describing, that you're probably looking into a time machine crossed with a mirror there, because I'm sure you see yourself at some point. But I'm sorry, I'm going to give a really corny segue here and say, but what I see is shelves stacked with LPs behind you. And you want to talk to us a bit about vinyl. And, you know, I hate the vinyl term, but, you know, I'm LP man. But
it's what people know now,
Yeah, it's what people know now. So I know you said that it varies, but what's particularly hot in that area? Maybe something like a cartridge. What would be you've given us the Blue Sound Node as your good entry-level budgety type of component for the digital listener. What's your analog equivalent of that?
Analog equivalent of that are probably from there isn't one that necessarily stands out. Edwards Audio Apprentice, the Riga Planar One, I think those are good products. Don't cost that much money, and
what kind of money are we talking about?
About 7,000 Rand, but less for a turntable. Including a cartridge. So that's kind of where it starts, with good quality, brand new turntables today. And strangely, big numbers of those are sold, but through less traditional channels than you would think. You know, for example, with the Groove Care brand, the accessories, I sell a lot to guys that are very much focused on specifically selling vinyl. So you actually find that...
If I may interject there briefly, for those, most of us have been here the whole time, but maybe for those of us who joined a bit late, just to point out that is your brand.
Groove Care, yes, right. So I'm noticing that record shops are starting to sell more and more hardware. And it's actually there where a lot of youngsters are starting to get introduced to better turntables, because that's the experience. It's the experience of that store that they end up with. They may be not venturing into typical audio businesses just yet. And I tend to find a lot of guys like those guys, when they do first upgrade, now they want a better cartridge and they want that fitted properly. They've done a bit of research. They figured out that, if you just bolt it on and hope for the best, you're not going to get the best out of it. So then they start hunting down people that can actually fit a cartridge properly for them. But I think those, around the 7,000 Rand mark, those are two hot products: the Edwards Audio Apprentice and the Riga Plain R1. If you want to get into vinyl at a basic level, that sounds really, really pleasant.
Okay, I just want to go to the chat line, and I see there's a question here from Rocco. So if you don't mind, I'll pass that on to Guillaume, and I'll read it out. With our technology advances, can one justify a pre-power versus an integrated on the high-end spectrum, extra cables, more components, more potential for data loss? Any thoughts on that?
I think not all pre-powers and not all integrators are obviously created equal, in my opinion. So if anybody, we spoke about DIY earlier, but anybody who's done a bit of DIY has probably figured out that the if you want to make a fairly neat case, the case, the connectors, and the transformer tends to take more money than the actual circuit that you're trying to create or trying to use. So with pre-power amplifiers, from the moment go, even if you use the same amount of electronics, your cost will be quite a bit higher on a pre-power, even if you stick the same components in. So I think over the years, the manufacturers have started figuring out what makes the difference between a preamp and a power amp versus an integrated. So your better quality integrateds today would use separate windings or maybe even separate transformers for the preamp stage and the power amp stage. Layout is different. Of course, a lot of integrated amplifiers don't have phono stages. One of the reasons for separating the preamp was always to move the sensitive phono stage away from the big transformer of the power amp. So I think up to a certain price point and up to a certain power output, as a general rule, you can probably get better performance out of an integrated amplifier for the same money as you would get out of a pre-power combination. There comes a point where you eclipse that performance and you will only get that from pre-power. You won't necessarily get that from an integrated. Very, very general statement, because there are, of course, exceptions to all of these rules.
Sure.
There are some really out there, crazy integrated amplifiers out there too.
Okay, and then another question from the chat line. It's an interesting one from Chris. You were talking about cables and soldering, and the question from Andrew Hooper is: any advice on what type of solder is good for homemade cables? DIY, whatever one wants to call them.
Well, I always use the Quad Eutectic solder, which has got a high silver content. So there are even on the industrial market, there are good silver content solders available. But I do sell the Cardus solder. It's, I think, just over 400 Rands for a 100-gram roll, which if you're a hobbyist will last you a really, really long time. If you just want to make up a couple of cables, my arm can normally be twisted to, sell you a couple of grams instead. Just to, because even if you go and buy a 500-gram roll of industrial grade but good quality solder from Multicore or Kester or one of the guys making good stuff, you're also in for a couple of 100 Rand, because they'll only sell you half a kilo on a roll typically. But ideally a solder with some silver content. And for DIY, despite the regulations and all the talk of lead-free, etc., I would recommend a leaded solder because it's really a lot easier to work with than lead-free solder.
I'm interested to see that. Yeah, by the way, I just got Andrew and Chris a bit mixed up in their question line there. But anyhow, Chris suggested that it's more important to have clean work really than the type of solder. But the point raised by one of our more experienced and qualified members, Sean Onverwacht, is he agrees with you about that Carter stuff, and he says, in fact, he recommends it for inexperienced DIYers. I think probably for the reason that you mentioned.
It's besides the fact that it's obviously a very good quality solder, and I believe it would be the right thing to use from a sonic point of view. Over the years, having worked with different solders, also from people like WBT, there used to be a solder called Wonder solder, which was also a high silver content solder, as well as multi-core silver solders. I've just found the Carter solder to just be the easiest flowing and easiest to work with. And obviously I'm biased, but I get that feedback from a lot of DIY guys who've used other solders and at some point have used some of the Carter stuff and just found that it works really, really well and is easy to work with. And I suppose if the solder is easy to work with, you'll end up with a quality join, and that's ultimately what you want. You know, if it's a difficult solder to work with, the inexperienced guy is going to make a bit of a messy connection.
Okay, we're drawing towards the close of our, it's almost an hour that we've been at it, and drawing towards the close of our chat. One thing I didn't ask you, of course, was how do people get hold of you?
Well, my website, which is it's getting a little clunky looking. It's due for a revamp. There's an email address on there, info@Croak, that does come through to my mailbox. Phone number is on there, and I do respond to AV Forum messages, not as often because I find them a little harder to get into than the mail, and obviously WhatsApps and so on. You know, the regular ways, but my contact details are on croak.co.za.
Uh-huh. And just if you wouldn't mind to close off, running through a few of those product brands that you represent once again.
All right. So on that are products that are import and distribute are the Funk Firm turntables. As well as accessories. Very popular is the Acromat, an upgrade turntable mat. Funk is the guy behind it is a chap called Arthur Kubasarian. He in the 80s was the guy, the technical brain behind the company Pink Triangle, which was probably the one UK contender to the Lynn turntable. And he kind of came up with a naked acrylic platter. You know, the fact that mating the record directly to an acrylic platter actually gives you a far better energy sink for the vibration set up by the stylus. Do we need to log back in?
No. I think what Chris has just alerted us that we are unmuted. So I see there's a question from Chris Teron, but maybe you want to ask that yourself, Chris, because the floor is now open for Q&A from the audience. So before we do that, in case I miss out on this, Guillaume, thanks very much for agreeing to being our guinea pig this evening.
No, it was very.
I think we're getting better at this. I hope it was as enjoyable for you as it certainly was for me. And yeah, well, it's more strength to your elbow in a very difficult market. Let's hope that things look up in the near future. And thank you all to the participants. There's quite a good crowd this evening, and thanks for taking the time to join us and experience a bit of what we do. I think I won't run through all the stuff that we do, but if you'd like to find out more, please drop us a line to capetownhificlub@gmail.com, and we'll put you on the mailing list and keep you updated. Thanks again. Over to you.
Does Chris Teron want to ask a question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
Yeah.
Chris, I can hear you.
Thanks, Guillaume. Just something interesting. I'm looking at the second-hand market, etc., and seeing what generally costs of LP12s that's sold. And I'm just interesting to know in modern times, entry level, or at what stage, or how much money should you spend to beat an old LP12 that has been maintained, that's set up, but old LP12.
Right. So it's a bit of a trick question. It's because an LP12 is not an LP12. There are so many iterations of it. So on today's market, you might buy a non-serviced mid-80s unit with maybe a Lynn basic arm on it for maybe 12 or 13,000 rand. And you might well be able to buy something with the Lingo power supply and an ITOC, or maybe even an ECOS tone arm for 25,000 rand. And those two turntables are vastly different in performance. And if you go maybe a little earlier, if you go say 6-7 years earlier than the basic arm unit, those are even further behind performance-wise. So you on the the sort of call it really early 80s unit, late 70s unit, you can probably get equivalent performance already out of something like a Riga Planar 3, Edwards Audio TT1 SE, especially because those turntables need very little setting up to sound good, whereas that Lynn will definitely need to be fettled, sorted properly to really sound the way that it can. Once you start getting to the unit with a Valhalla power supply and the basic tone arm from say mid to late 80s, you're probably going to have to look at something like Riga RP6 Clear Audio Concept to equal or better its performance, and you're going to have to spend a little bit more again if you start talking about a Lynn with an ITOC and an ECOS and say a Lingo power supply. But a big thing is that a lot of the newer turntables need a lot less fiddling with to keep them at the performance level that they can be at. You can kind of set them up once, from time to time change a belt, clean the surface that the belt runs on, and as and when required, obviously a new cartridge or a new stylus. Whereas the Lynn turntables just tend to be a little bit more finicky, in that the suspension goes off kilter, and when that's not the way it's supposed to be, it really sounds a bit soggy and not the way it should. But yeah, I think they still, if you're prepared to buy a Lynn and then spend a little bit of money on getting it serviced by somebody who knows what they're doing, and who can put in the right new spares on the suspension, they are still very much viable purchases. But you need to understand that everything Lynn costs quite a bit of money. So, a Lynn belt at this point in time is £55. The proper Lynn belt is £55. So a typical, if a Lynn hasn't been touched for 7 or 8 or 10 years or 15 years, you're going to pay somebody 2,000 to 3,000 rand to put a new belt, some fresh oil in the bearing, clean everything up. It might need a bit of work on the power supply and that. So you need to take that into account as well if you're buying one. If you want to move on from one, I think the numbers that I've mentioned give you an indication of where you would have to look.
Thanks for that illuminating insight there. And I'd just like to give a little bit of a plug for one of our upcoming talks, which we're trying to put together, that will feature a guy who I think is quite expert in the matter of turntables and Lynn's in particular. So watch this space. We hope to have a turntable whisperer on in the near future.
Thanks for that.
Fine. Are there any more questions? Anybody? There's 2 more chats on there. Let's have a look what they have to say. Oh, just to thank you for chatting to us from Winton, and Chris Ron as well. Thanks, Guillaume.
Thank you.
Fine.
Well,
can I just check something, Chris? Anthony, you there?
Yes.
Listening, Chris.
Yeah, I'm so curious about the South African, let's call it hi-fi industry, particularly retail. And I think our guest tonight, did the hard yards in that industry. Do hi-fi shops still exist? I know the online and all that. I know all the rest of it. But is there room for a specialist dealer? And is there space? And is there a future?
I think South Africa is a challenging market, and I think one of our biggest problems is actually security. I mean, so if you want to run a high-end store that has got a continuously open door to the public, and you want us to be safe, you're kind of forced into our quite expensive shopping malls. For a high-end dealer, you would need a fair amount of space for decent listening rooms, and the turnover per square meter that you can probably do from the product can be a bit of a challenge. So I think that's why the current folk that are still retailing like that have to do a very, very wide portfolio of products, so that they can do those turnovers they need to pay for those expensive shops. But a dedicated stereo store in a nice mall, I think that's quite a challenge. And I think not even just South Africa, even if you look internationally, one will actually find that the high-end stores are moving off the high street, often moving in. Guys will buy or rent a house in totality and actually run a dealership from there. I'm talking overseas. I know there's a company in the US. I think I think they were called the Audio Pimp. They've set up a high-end second-hand business, extreme high-end second-hand business, but it's out of town, and you actually get picked up in a fairly luxury car and taken to their showroom. So I think worldwide shopping space is getting expensive, and the way high-end hi-fi is to be presented is a challenge in these expensive retail spaces.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, carry on, Stefan.
Yeah.
You offer rewiring turntable arms.
Yes.
So if one lives in Cape Town, how would one go about doing that?
You need to pack it. You would need to pack it really, really carefully. And always pack it with the counterweight removed from the tone arm. It also depends a little bit on the tone arm, which tone arm it is, how feasible it is. But I'd also give a shout out, I guess, to my friend Jacques Passier, who runs Turntable Guy in Cape Town, who does buy the cordless wire from me as well to do tone arm rewires. So that might be a simpler solution, is to see if Jacques isn't prepared to do the job for you, because then you wouldn't have to pack it as carefully, which can be a challenge if you don't have the original packaging for the arm.
Much safer too.
You don't sell the cable so that one can do a DIY job.
Yes, I'm totally happy to sell you the wire, sell you the little cartridge clips, a little bit of solder, the little, you'll also struggle to get the right colored heat shrink for the cartridge clips. Happy to help you with all of that for your DIY endeavor. Just do your research before you get started. And the biggest tip I can give anybody on rewiring a tone arm is make sure that at no point in time there is no wire in the arm. So whatever you do, always use a wire to pull in another wire. If you could start with the original wire to pull in a thinner draw wire, or a draw wire which you would use to pull the new wire in, but never pull the old stuff out and then try and get the new wire in, because then you'll struggle. You'll probably be faced with taking the arm apart, and I don't believe that on your better arms you'll be able to Yes, Johan, I saw there dental floss. Fish gut also works well. You always make sure you pull something into the arm to pull the next, however many stages you do, but just make sure there's always something in the arm. Never pull out the wire, because when you disassemble it and you take the bearings out and try and put that back together without the factory jig, you will never get that arm to be either as smooth moving without rattles as they would have managed in the factory. So don't take it apart, and never have it empty. Always have a wire inside there.
And you're going to add to that explanation, Guillaume, which is fantastic. The PS to that is, don't ask me how I know this.
You're quite right. You're quite right.
Yeah.
I did learn the hard way a long time ago in my own second-hand Riga 3 when I was about 17.
Thank you.
And of course, sometimes you get an arm that people have actually pulled the wire out, and then you've just got to try and, then it gets interesting. Then we end up with little pieces of lead on the end of the fish gut, dropping them through holes and trying to shake them through the arm tube. My last resort is to take them apart. I really do not like taking them apart.
Right, guys, Chris, I think you're the guys who's twiddling the knobs.
We did very well tonight. A message from Felix, thank you very much. He's glad to be a part of it. I'd like to see the face behind the name. That's also important too.
Indeed, indeed, indeed.
You always never quite how we envisage.
Okay. Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Anthony, for a good job.
Thanks, guys. It's been great as always.
And don't forget, the link to the recording will be posted on the forum and emailed to everybody on the mailing list from tomorrow sometime.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Lovely to see you all. Have a great rest of the evening.
Are we done?
Happy birthday, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Empty now. It's empty, but it's here.
Oh, yeah.
Day 0.
I'll raise a virtual glass.
Yeah, day 0.
Really?